in France, right? So, you may or may not know, but there were huge riots in France that were violent. They're over many different things here are going on. And so what I did was I was looking through the papers this morning, and there was a pretty big piece in the Sunday New York Times because there had been enough time, and since all this stuff, and it's trying to, I believe, and this is by Adam Nossiter, or Nossiter, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Nossiter. I'm going to read a little bit of this. And then we're going to go to Le Monde, and then we hit Google Translate, and there is a live coverage of things that are happening in France in reaction to the protests right now. One of the things is the protesters arrived for these conversations, which were scheduled in reaction to the fact that the protests have happened, and they said we want them filmed and posted to Facebook, was their demand, and the government said no, and they walked out. That was the first thing that happened this morning. So we'll get to more of what is going on in reaction to the protests in France over the weekend. But let's unpack the protests in France with this piece out of the New York Times from Sunday, the Sunday New York Times, written in Guéret, France. At the bare bottom of Florian Dohu's shopping cart at the discount supermarket, there was a packet of $6 sausages and not much else. It was the end of last week and the end of last month. At that point, quote, my salary and my wife's had been gone for 10 days, he lamented. How to survive those days between when the money runs out and when his paycheck arrives for his work as a warehouse handler has become a monthly challenge. The same is true for so many others in Guéret, a grim provincial town in south-central France, and it has made Mr. Dohu angry. So he used what money he had left and drove 250 miles to join the fiery protests on Saturday in Paris, where the police moved in with tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets. Quote, we knew they were sent in to get rid of us, he said the day after, and believe me, they were not into Mr. Nice Guy. But he vows the protesters are not going anywhere. The Yellow Vest protests he is a part of present an extraordinary venting of rage and resentment by ordinary working people, aimed at the mounting inequalities that have eroded their lives. The unrest began in response to rising gas taxes, and has been building in intensity over the past 3 weeks, peaking on Saturday. That's when all this collision happened. Welcome, second viewer. This is the AntiClimactic NonShow. We're reading from the New York Times about the protests in France. With little organization and relying mostly on social media, they have moved spontaneously from France's poor rural regions over the last month to the banks of the Seine, where they have now become impossible to ignore. On Sunday, President Emmanuel Macron toured the graffiti-scrawled monuments of the capital and the damage along some of the richest shopping streets in Europe. All around France, the protests left 3 dead and more than 260 wounded, with more than 400 arrested. Mr. Macron convened a crisis cabinet meeting, weighing whether to impose a state of emergency. Mr. Macron has previously insisted that, unlike past French governments, he will not back down in the face of popular resistance to reforms like a loosening of labor laws. It's a harder line than many other Western European countries have taken. Now that line's interesting, because I think there's an increased movement in the other direction there. It's a harder line than many other Western European countries have taken. Macron's line, we're saying. The protesters ridicule him as a president of the rich and say he is trying to balance his budgets on their backs as he remains deaf to their concerns. But if it was the shattered glass and burned cars along Rue de Rivoli or Boulevard Haussmann in Paris that finally got Mr. Macron's attention, the movement named for the roadside safety vests worn by demonstrators, you must have seen footage by now, has in fact welled up from silent towns like Guéret, an administrative center of 13,000 people lost in the small valleys of central France. Far from any big city, it sits in one of the poorest departments of France, where the public hospital is the biggest employer. The cafe in the main square is empty by mid-afternoon. The hulks of burned-out cars dot the moribund train station's tiny parking lot, abandoned by citizens too poor to maintain them. In places like these, a quiet fear gnaws at households. What happens when the money runs out around the 20th? What do I put in the refrigerator with nothing left in the account and the electricity bill to pay? Which meal should I skip today? How do I tell my wife again there is no going out this weekend? The stories of Mr. Doud's neighbors, who also joined the protests, were much like his own. Inside Laetitia Desportu's freezer were hunks of frozen meat, a twice-a-year gift from her farmer father, and the 6-member family's meat ration. On these cold nights, Joël Decue's oven burned the wood he chopped himself because he can't afford gas for heating. It is not deep poverty, but ever-present unease in the small cities, towns, and villages over what is becoming known as the other France, away from the glitzy Parisian boulevards that were the scene of rioting this weekend. Quote, "We live with stress," said Fabrice Girardin, 46, a former carpet layer who now looks after other people's pets to get by. "Every month, at the end of the month, we say, will there be enough to eat?" Since the acidic portrait of Géret in novels by a famous native son, the anti-Semitic 20th century writer Marcel Johandeau, the town is used to being mocked as the epitome of provincial backwardness. The Yellow Vest protesters, the descendants of those who inspired Johandeau's characters, can now be found waiting at the roadblocks as you come into town. Truck and school bus drivers, nurses, out-of-work electricians, housewives, warehouse handlers, part-time civil servants, and construction workers on disability aid. Mr. Doud, who says his 9-year-old son has never been on vacation and his gross salary is 1,300 euros a month, about $1,475, disappears immediately in the bills, quote. He was among the people there. "There is little left after high taxes and costly utilities such as electricity. To protest, he and the other protesters wait at night in the middle of the roundabouts in the rain and cold and mud, under makeshift tarpaulin shelters and tents in the darkness of early morning. The People's Élysée is scrawled on one, mocking Mr. Macron's Élysée Palace, seat of the presidency. Quote, Macron, he's with the bosses. Macron, he's against the people, a singer intoned in a reggae-like jingle from the radio. Mr. Doud said he joined the movement from the beginning, and he was an assiduous presence over several days last week on the traffic circles at Guéret. He was there at 11 at night on a rainy Thursday after putting in several hours that morning, and he was there the next day as well. We don't even need the social networks anymore, he said. His motivation, he said, was to recover the country's priorities, the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The gas tax, quote, was what set it all off. Now he felt that the Yellow Vest protesters really have the government on the run. They don't know what to do. They're really in a panic, he said. Virtually every car that passes honks in sympathy. But the protesters know that their shouts grow faint over the long distance to real power in Paris. Over the long distance to the real power in Paris. And that is what has propelled them to move their demonstrations there. By Friday, Mr. Doud was preparing to make the drive in a shared car up to Paris, checking in with his comrades at the traffic circle and buying last-minute supplies, including solution to protect his eyes from tear gas. Johan Dufus, an out-of-work electrical lineman in his 30s, who was presented by Guéret's Yellow Vest protesters as their spokesman, had been arrested in Paris the week before. I've never been in political demonstrations before, he said, but we said enough's enough. They don't even know how we get by with our tiny little salaries, he said, but we are humans too, for God's sake. He was getting by with vegetables and help from his part-time farmer father. None of the Guéret protesters expressed allegiance to any politician. Most said politics disgusted them. They're all the same, Mr. Doud said. When Guéret's mayor, Michel Vernier, a veteran socialist with decades of connections in Paris, went to see the protesters, they were not welcoming. There's a rejection of politicians, Mr. Vernier said. They are outside all political and union organizations. Welcome, viewers. We're reading about the Yellow Vest protesters from a detailed piece that was in the New York Times on Sunday. And then we're going to take a look at Le Monde and use Google Translate and follow up on the story as far as the meetings that went or didn't happen today between protesters and government representatives. It was the end of the month. To a man and woman, the Yellow Vest protesters of Riot said their accounts were tapped out. So the protests were actually, let's see, the first was Saturday, right? So if you think about it. Sorry, their accounts were tapped out. Quote, right now I'm at zero, Mr. Girardin said. His wife had done the shopping with 40 euros the day before, a Wednesday. Now there was nothing left to get them through the weekend. Quote, you get to the end of the month, there's nothing, he said. That is why Mr. Macron's plan to raise the gasoline tax, modest and increment as it may seem, was the final straw for so many. The spark that's finally set off a seething rage that has been building up for years. There was no gas in his car, said Mr. Girardin, a carpet layer who quit a job with a stagnant 1,200 euro a month salary to strike out on his own. But he was no better off now. Quote, once we've finished paying all of our bills, there's no money left. Tonight's meal, noodles with maybe a little ground beef. Quote, I'd like to be able to take my wife to the restaurant from time to time, but I can't, Mr. Girardin said. Oh, French people disappointed they can't go to a restaurant? No, sir. But talk about walking right into a stereotype there. Weighed down by financial stress, she had gone into a depression. She's totally closed in on herself, he said. Well, sorry, I shouldn't make light. It's terrible. It's terrible. Up the road the next morning, Miss Deportu, a night shift nurse at the hospital, was up at 6:30 in the morning with her husband, Olivier, an optician, to see their 3 daughters off to school in the darkness. Their modest house at a country intersection at the edge of town was pleasant but not spacious. She gently mocked him because, quote, there's never any gas in your car. With 4 children and many bills, their money, 1,800 euros a month for her, 1,500 for him, was, quote, very quickly gone, Mr. Deportu said. The bank refused to lend them any more money. Both had joined the Yellow Vests, and both had gone to Paris the preceding weekend to demonstrate. As long as it continues, we are with it, he said. We live, but we've got to be careful. We can't go to the restaurant. All the little pleasures of life are gone, Mr. Deportu said. His parents, after a lifetime of work, were reduced to penury. His father in a nursing home, and his mother forced to accept meals from charity. She fills the freezer with deep discounted frozen food from the hard discounter Lidl, I don't know how to pronounce Lidl, L-I-D-L, but the shops. They went to get paid to fill up the car. Sorry, they wait to get paid to fill up the car and to do the shopping. We just don't make it to the end of the month, said Elodie Martin, a mother of 4 who had joined the protesters at the demonstration outside town. I've got 10 euros left, she said, as a dozen others tried to get themselves warm around an iron barrel fire. Luckily, we've got some animals at the house, chickens, ducks, and we keep them for the end of the month, she said. It sounds brutal, but my priority is the children, she said. We're fed up and we're angry, shouted her husband, Thomas Schwint, a cement hauler on a temporary 1,200 euro contract. To a man and woman, the Jarret protesters expressed fury at the government and determination to keep going. Quote, their response has poisoned the situation even more, Mr. Deportu said. The citizens have asked for lower taxes, and they're saying ecology, he said in a reference to Mr. Macron's speech of last week, where he outlined France's plans to transition from fossil-based fuels to renewable energy. At the roundabout, Laurent Offreur, a truck driver, was deciding which of that day's meals to skip. Quote, if I stop rolling, I die. This is not nothing, Mr. Offreur said. What's happening right now is a citizen uprising. Okay, forgive my editorializing and coughing. But that was a piece by Adam Nossiter in the New York Times this week about what is going on in France and who these protesters are. And so this morning I went to Le Monde and I popped it in using the Google Translate to find the live stream of the reaction between the government and the protesters. There was supposed to be a meeting this morning, which from what I understand, hang on, it's not translating the thing. Let me just go back to since it's live, it's updating, so we have to go back to the front page. But this is going to take us right to the 20-minute music break, actually. But we were going to talk about how to do that. Basically, again, this discussion about how to use news sources yourself when you want to get material is part of the show. And I was trying to show people the other day, for example, you can just have a tab like this where, this is the AP, the BBC, the New York Times, the Mercury News, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. You can add foreign papers like Le Monde, and then when you go to Le Monde, Google will allow you to hit this translate button. Translate the page, yes. And then now you're looking at, it's not going to be correct English or whatever all the time, but you're going to at least be able to follow what is happening in the paper if you don't speak French. Macron, quote, postpones his visit to Serbia. That's interesting. So this is the live coverage that they've been having all morning. I just wanted to show you basically how I would go about doing that, and recommend you do the same. It's really simple nowadays with Google and the internet to find international sources for stories that you're interested in. And newspapers that I use are Le Monde, La Jornada from Mexico City, but there's a couple of better ones in South America now. It's been a while since I've done this, so I'm going to have to go pull a few of those up. Okay, so Macron has postponed his visit to Serbia. Let's see what's going on here. Oh man, an 80-year-old protester died. An 80-year-old woman was struck with a tear gas grenade. According to Le Monde, yes, the Yellow Vests are mostly supported in the polls. There's methodology here too. This is all within the last half hour. Now, one of the interesting things about doing a show like this where we can do really live stuff is, there's stuff I can write, like I opened the show today with some stuff I wrote about what's happening with Qatar. And there's things I can read, like I can find stuff that are interesting to read. But it's cool, since we're streaming live, to follow things that are happening live. And those kinds of things, I wouldn't want to just read out, what's going on without some analytical comprehension of them. So maybe another thing that one could do is you could actually go there as well.